There is a piece of information that has been circulating for 48 hours and that has not received anywhere near the attention it deserves. On April 15th, Donald Trump wrote a personal letter to Xi Jinping. He asked China's president not to arm Iran. Xi responded within 24 hours. He denied that any weapons transfers were happening or planned. Trump accepted the denial. 2 days later, Trump told Fox Business that the Iran war is, and I am quoting him directly, very close to over. Take a moment to absorb what that actually means. The United States Navy is currently enforcing the most consequential naval blockade in modern history. The economic damage to Iran is running at $435 million a day. Oil is trading above $120 a barrel. The IMF is warning of a potential global recession. The largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market is in its 7th week. And the central strategic question of this entire crisis, whether China intervenes on Iran's behalf or stands aside, was resolved by an exchange of unverifiable letters between two heads of state 4 weeks before a summit in Beijing. Take a moment to absorb what that actually means, because the answer is not what the headlines are telling you. Here is what is actually at stake in this story, and why it matters to every market, every supply chain, and every government on Earth right now. The U.S.-Israel air campaign against Iran began on February 28th with the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz on March 4th, the waterway through which 25% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas had been transiting every day for decades. On April 15th, the United States declared its own counter-blockade, a complete naval cordon of Iranian ports, severing 90% of Tehran's remaining international sea trade. The financial fallout is now running through every major market simultaneously. Brent crude is above $120 a barrel. The Gulf states Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE have collectively lost at least 10 million barrels per day in production and export capacity. The IMF has cut global growth to 3.1% for 2026. The IEA has formally characterized this as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Iran's own central bank has warned that the combined damage of the war and the blockade could take 12 years to repair. And at the precise center of all of this, buying nearly every barrel of Iranian oil still moving, 157.7 million barrels at sea, 98% bound for Chinese ports, is China. Today, I am going to break down what Beijing is actually calculating, why its response has been so deliberately quiet, what the exchange of letters between Trump and Xi really means at the strategic level, and what happens in the next 90 days that no one in mainstream coverage is saying out loud. If you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, specifically what happens at the May 14th summit in Beijing, whether the manpad's intelligence gets confirmed or quietly buried, and what China's next move in this crisis reveals about its calculations on Taiwan, subscribe to this channel now and activate notifications. I track every significant development in this story the moment it happens, and I break it down with the specificity and historical context that mainstream coverage consistently fails to provide. The next 2 weeks in this crisis are the most consequential since the blockade began. Let's go through this completely. The first dimension is the economics of Iran's collapse and why the clock is running faster than Tehran's public statements suggest. Before the US-Israel campaign began, Iran was already experiencing the deepest and longest economic crisis in its modern history. Inflation had reached 48.6% by October 2025. The Iranian rial, which traded at 42,000 to the US dollar less than a decade ago, has now collapsed past 1.1 million to the dollar, a loss of more than 96% of its purchasing power. The country had been surviving on sanctions, evasion, oil exported in the shadows through a network of ghost tankers, and political repression that suppressed domestic reaction to the economic deterioration. The US naval blockade ended even that. The cordon declared fully implemented on April 15th cuts off the 90% of Iran's international sea trade that powers what remains of its economy. The estimated daily damage, $435 million. Monthly, approximately $13 billion. Iran's central bank has gone on record warning that rebuilding the war-damaged economy could take 12 years, and that estimate was made before the full blockade was in place. At $13 billion a month in economic attrition, the arithmetic is not complicated. The question is not whether Iran's economy can survive this blockade intact. The question is, which breaks first? The Iranian government's political hold over its population, or Washington's political will to maintain the blockade under sustained international pressure. But here is what the coverage is missing. The economic pain is not falling exclusively on Iran. The Gulf states that Iran's strait closure was supposed to punish are simultaneously experiencing their own compounding crisis. 70% of the region's food imports have been disrupted. Iranian missile and drone strikes on desalination infrastructure have threatened drinking water for 99% of Kuwait's and Qatar's populations. The GCC states, which get over 80% of their caloric intake through strait transit, are managing a parallel humanitarian emergency that no one in the Western press is covering with adequate seriousness. This is not a clean American victory. It is a war whose economic blast radius is hitting every actor in the theater simultaneously at different rates toward a cliff that all of them can see coming. The first actor to run out of runway determines how this ends, and that actor may not be who you expect. The second dimension is China's double game and why its restraint in this crisis is not caution, it is strategy. Beijing's public response to the Iran blockade has been conspicuously measured. No vitriolic denunciations of U.S. aggression, no visible effort to exploit American strategic overextension. At the United Nations, China has called for restraint and dialogue. In official statements, it has described the blockade as a violation of international law and then done nothing to act on that characterization. Western analysts have interpreted this as caution. Some have called it weakness. It is neither. Here is what is actually happening. China currently imports 1.4 million barrels of Iranian oil per day, roughly 80% of Iran's total exported volume. Iran, facing the existential pressure of the U.S. blockade, has granted Chinese vessels a formal exemption from its own closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Chinese tankers pass through while ships from every other nation are turned back, seized, or warned off. As of April 15th, maritime intelligence firm Windward estimates 157.7 million barrels of Iranian crude are currently at sea. 98% are bound for Chinese ports. This oil is not moving at market price. Intelligence analysis and shipping data indicate Iran is selling at $50 to $60 per barrel below Brent, a distressed discount driven by Iran's desperate need to generate any hard currency at all while its ports are being choked. The mathematics of that discount, at 1.4 million barrels per day, at a $50 per barrel concession, China is capturing approximately $70 million a day in value that it could not access if the strait were open and Iran were whole. Every day the blockade continues and Iranian oil keeps moving to China. Beijing extracts the equivalent of a sanctions windfall at Iran's expense. And then Xi Jinping writes Trump a letter saying China is not arming Iran. Trump accepts it, announces the war is very close to over. The May summit is confirmed. China never had to choose. It extracted maximum economic value from Iran's distress. It maintained clean hands with Washington. Russia has simultaneously offered China an energy supply deal, an insurance policy, for the moment Iranian barrels stop moving entirely. China's strategic oil reserves cover over 120 days of net imports at current consumption rates. Beijing is not under pressure. Beijing is not choosing sides. Beijing is harvesting. But there is a third and deeper dimension, and this is the one that the exchange of letters between Trump and Xi was really about. The third and deepest dimension is the Taiwan rehearsal. Here is the question that no one in mainstream coverage is asking directly. Why has China been so quiet, not just cautious, not just restrained, but genuinely, conspicuously, structurally quiet at a moment when the United States is demonstrating the most aggressive naval enforcement action in the Indo-Pacific era? The surface answer: Beijing does not want to blow up the May 14th summit by confirming a weapons transfer that would trigger 50% tariffs on its economy. That is true, but it is the first layer. The deeper answer is that China is not reacting to this crisis. China is analyzing it, and the analysis is about Taiwan, not Iran. The United States has now demonstrated in real operational time that it can enforce a naval blockade against a medium-sized military power, one with ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and hardened coastal defenses, and sustain that blockade against an economy worth hundreds of billions of dollars without triggering a direct military response from either China or Russia. Beijing is measuring three things simultaneously. First, can the US hold a blockade under sustained economic and diplomatic pressure from the international community? So far, the answer is yes. The IMF is complaining. The UN is complaining. The EU is complaining. The blockade holds. Second, what does the absence of a great power response tell China about the political cost of enforcing a maritime exclusion zone in contested waters? The answer: significantly lower than prior strategic assessments suggested. Third, and this is the question that will reverberate across Indo-Pacific strategy for the next decade: does a US naval blockade of Iranian ports create a legal and strategic precedent that China can invoke when it applies coercive pressure against Taiwan? A Democratic congressman named this directly in public on April 15th. The diplomat ran the formal strategic analysis. South China Morning Post published it. The answer, according to multiple legal and geopolitical assessments, is yes. The United States has argued in practice and is now enforcing in practice that national security supersedes navigation rights when a state deems it necessary. That legal argument cuts in both directions. China is not responding to the Iran crisis. China is reading it the way a chess player reads a sacrifice. The question is not what the sacrifice costs. The question is what the sacrifice reveals about the rules of the board. Every analyst watching this story is asking the wrong question. The question being asked is, will China back Iran? The question that actually matters is, why would China need to? What is actually driving Beijing's strategic restraint is not fear of Trump's 50% tariff threat. It is not loyalty to Washington ahead of the summit. It is not even the legal complexity of openly supporting a state under US military blockade. What is driving China's restraint is this: Iran's controlled weakening is more strategically valuable to Beijing than Iran's survival, and far more valuable than Iran's collapse. Consider the architecture carefully. Under the current arrangement, Iran needs China more than China needs Iran. That is a structural reversal. For years, China was the dependent party needing Iranian oil, needing the supply relationship. The blockade has flipped the dependency entirely. Iran cannot sell its oil to anyone else. China is the one buyer with the Hormuz exemption. Iran is now a captive supplier, forced to accept $50 to $60 per barrel below market rate to generate any revenue at all. The evidence for this structural reversal comes from three specific data points that the mainstream coverage has failed to synthesize. First, Iran granted China a formal, unilateral shipping exemption from its own Strait blockade. This is not a commercial arrangement, this is a geopolitical dependency made explicit. Tehran is signaling to Beijing that Chinese favor is the difference between economic survival and immediate total collapse. Iran is not negotiating with China from strength. Iran is negotiating from dependence. Second, Russia made a formal energy supply offer to China on April 15th, the same day the US declared its blockade fully implemented. Russia is offering China an alternative source for the barrels that Iran currently supplies. This means China does not need Iranian oil specifically. It needs cheap oil. Iran provides it now. Russia can provide it later. China is not exposed. Third, Xi's response to Trump's letter arrived within 24 hours. He denied the manpad's shipment. He accepted Trump's framing. He confirmed the summit. The speed and completeness of that response tells you that the decision had already been made before the letter arrived. Trump's letter was not leverage. It was a cue for a confirmation China had already written. Here is the framing failure of Western coverage. Every outlet is treating this as a story about whether China will save Iran. That frame assumes Beijing wants Iran saved. But an Iran that survives this crisis intact, that rebuilds its military, reopens the strait, restores its oil revenues, and re-establishes its regional posture, is an Iran that no longer needs to sell oil to China at a $50 discount. An Iran that is whole no longer gives Beijing a special Hormuz exemption. An Iran that is whole has options. The optimal outcome for China is not Iran's collapse and not Iran's survival. It is Iran's prolonged strategic dependence, weakened enough to remain a captive supplier, strong enough to keep the exemption in place, and positioned permanently as a client rather than a partner. At this ratio, China is not choosing between Washington and Tehran. China is managing both, at Iran's expense, while quietly reading the legal and strategic playbook the United States is writing for future use in other waters. The mathematics are not competitive, and Beijing knows it. 3 scenarios, 3 trajectories. Scenario A, the most likely path, 60% probability. Iran accepts a negotiated framework before the May 14th summit in Beijing. The signals are already placed. Trump has publicly described the war as very close to over. Iranian negotiating channels have made private contact with U.S. intermediaries, according to multiple current reporting threads. The parameters of a framework are visible. Iran halts its Hormuz closure under international supervision, the U.S. lifts the port blockade in stages, and a nuclear compliance mechanism is reinstated in some form. Oil retreats from $120 toward $90 to $95 a barrel, elevated by historical standards, but manageable for global markets. Gulf supply resumes over the following 60 to 90 days. At the May 14th summit, Trump and Xi announce a joint stabilization framework for the Middle East. Trump declares a strategic victory. Xi claims the role of mediator. The 50% tariff threat is quietly shelved. The manpad's intelligence report is classified and left unaddressed. The Trump-Xi trade relationship is reset toward the May summit agenda. Watch for one specific signal, whether the May summit agenda expands to include a bilateral trade framework beyond the Iran issue. If it does, the deal is already locked. The summit is the announcement, not the negotiation. The catch under Scenario A is structural. The legal precedent of the U.S. blockade stands unchallenged and unreversed. It is now part of the operational architecture of international maritime law, or rather, the documented evidence that a sufficiently powerful state can override it without consequence. Every government with a disputed maritime frontier has registered this. That precedent does not expire with the ceasefire. Scenario B, the escalation path, 25% probability. U.S. intelligence confirms the manpad's transfer either through a direct intercept or through an incident in which U.S. or allied military aircraft in the Gulf theater are engaged by Iranian forces using Chinese-manufactured shoulder-fired systems. The evidence is released publicly. The May summit is cancelled. The 50% tariff drops on China within 48 hours. The U.S.-China economic relationship enters an effectively wartime posture. Global markets reprice. The summit collapses immediately. Current estimates from financial analysts suggest an 8 to 12% equity market correction within 72 hours of confirmation. Oil surges toward $150 per barrel. The $50 to $60 Iran oil discount that China was capturing disappears, replaced by a 50% tariff penalty on China's entire export relationship with the United States. The net economic damage to China from this scenario is not a trade disruption. It is a structural decoupling event accelerated by years. The specific tripwire to watch: any U.S. military aircraft incident in the Gulf theater, followed by an unusually rapid Pentagon evidence release about weapon origin. The speed of the evidence package will tell you whether Washington was waiting for an incident or responding to one. Under Scenario B, the gradual, managed decoupling of U.S. and Chinese supply chains, which has been proceeding slowly since 2018, becomes sudden, politically driven, and irreversible on any short-term horizon. That is not a recession risk. That is a restructuring of the global economy on a 10-year timeline. Scenario C, the surprise. 15% probability. Iran's government fractures under the combined weight of the blockade, the military campaign, and the domestic economic crisis before any diplomatic framework is agreed. The Revolutionary Guards splinter. The regime loses central authority over its own military assets before a succession structure can be established. This is the scenario that every actor in this crisis claims to want to avoid. It is the one that none of them have made adequate contingency plans for. A post-regime Iran with no central authority is not a solved problem. It is a new and more dangerous problem. Ballistic missile infrastructure, drone manufacturing capacity, and weapons stockpiles become proliferation risks across a region where Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and multiple non-state actors are simultaneously positioned to act. Under Scenario C, the defining geopolitical contest of the next decade is not the Iran-Israel war. It is the competition over who controls Iran's reconstitution, who secures its energy infrastructure, who establishes the relationship with whatever successor government emerges, and who prevents weapons proliferation from the collapse of the IRGC's command structure. The US, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Israel do not wait for the dust to settle. They move simultaneously into the vacuum. This is not peace. This is the first chapter of something considerably longer. The summation is this: what is happening in the Persian Gulf right now is not a war about Iran. It is a negotiation about the architecture of global order, about who can enforce economic coercion against whom, at what scale, without triggering a response from the other great powers. That negotiation is being conducted in public through blockades and tariff threats and exchanged letters between heads of state, but its consequences are structural. The rules being written in the Gulf this month will govern the decisions made in the Taiwan Strait in the years ahead. Watch Beijing's Iranian oil import figures over the next 3 weeks. Watch the Manpad's intelligence assessment, specifically whether it is upgraded, downgraded, or quietly buried in the week before the summit. Watch the May 14th summit agenda. If it narrows to a symbolic meeting, the deal is under pressure. If it expands to include trade architecture, the deal was made weeks ago, and we are watching the announcement. 3 signals, 3 watches. The answers will tell you which scenario is already in motion. In 1956, the United States forced Britain and France to halt the Suez operation by threatening economic sanctions, not military force. What Washington demonstrated that day was that economic coercion, applied with precision, could stop a military campaign cold. What Moscow and Beijing registered was the same lesson. And they spent the 70 years that followed building the financial architecture, the reserve currencies, the energy corridors, and the multilateral institutions designed to make that lesson reversible. Whether they have succeeded is the question the Persian Gulf is now answering in real time. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and those who cannot hear the rhyme are always surprised by what comes next. All sources are available in the description. Verify every figure for yourself.